In the remote mountains of Eastern Europe, where ancient traditions clash with modern survival, one man's simple act of kindness would ignite a chain of events that would challenge everything he believed about love, honor, and the price of compassion. What began as a tailor's gesture to help a desperate young woman would soon bring an entire warrior clan to his doorstep, demanding answers that could cost him his life. This is the true story of how a white wedding dress became the catalyst for an extraordinary encounter between two worlds that were never meant to meet. The morning fog clung to the cobblestone streets of Brasov like an old man's breath, thick and heavy with the promise of another ordinary day. Mikhail Petrov adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and unlocked the wooden door of his small tailoring shop, the brass bell above chiming its familiar greeting to the empty street. At 62, Mikhail had grown accustomed to solitude. His wife Elena had passed 3 winters ago, leaving him with nothing but memories and the steady rhythm of needle and thread to mark his days. The shop itself was a testament to decades of meticulous craftsmanship. Bolts of fabric lined the walls in rainbow cascades, from the finest silks imported from Budapest to sturdy woolens that could withstand the harsh mountain winters. His workbench dominated the center of the room, scattered with half-finished projects, measuring tapes, and the collection of scissors that Elena had always teased him about. Each pair had its purpose, she would say, watching him work with the same devotion other men reserved for prayer. Mikhail had inherited the shop from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. 3 generations of Petrov men had measured, cut, and sewn within these walls, creating everything from simple work clothes to elaborate wedding gowns. The wedding gowns had always been Elena's specialty. She possessed an almost magical ability to understand what a bride envisioned, translating dreams into reality with delicate lacework and flowing silks. Since her death, Mikhail had avoided such commissions. The memories were too fresh, too painful. On this particular morning in late September, the air carried the sharp bite of approaching winter. The tourists who flocked to Brasov during the summer months had long since returned to their comfortable lives in Bucharest or Vienna, leaving the town to its year-round residents. Mikhail appreciated the quiet. It allowed him to focus on the steady work that kept his hands busy and his mind occupied. He was adjusting the display in his front window when he first saw her. She moved through the fog like a ghost, her massive frame barely visible until she was almost at his door. Mikhail's first thought was that she must be lost. Tourists occasionally wandered into his shop looking for directions, though none had ever looked quite like this woman. She stood nearly 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block out the weak morning sun. Her clothes were a patchwork of repairs and replacements, clearly assembled for whatever material she could find. A man's coat, far too small for a frame, stretched across her back. Her boots were cracked leather held together with rope and determination. But it was her face that captured Mikhail's attention. Despite her imposing size and raggedness, she possessed a striking beauty that seemed to emanate from within. Her eyes, a deep emerald green, held an intelligence that spoke of hidden depths. She paused outside his shop, pressing her face against the glass like a child gazing into a candy store. Her breath fogged the window as she studied the displayed garments with an intensity that made Mikhail uncomfortable. There was something desperate in her examination, as if she were searching for salvation among the fabric and thread. When she finally pushed through the door, the brass bell announcing her arrival, Mikhail found himself stepping backward involuntarily. Her presence filled the shop in a way that had nothing to do with her physical size. She moved with surprising grace, her eyes immediately drawn to a corner where Elena's old wedding dress display still stood, covered now with a white sheet that Mikhail hadn't had the heart to remove. The woman spoke in a language Mikhail didn't recognize, her voice deep and musical despite its obvious strain. She gestured toward the cover display, then to herself, then back again. Her meaning was unclear, but her desperation was evident in every line of her body. She reached into her coat and withdrew a small cloth bag, appending it onto his workbench. Coins scattered across the surface, a mixture of currencies that told a story of long travel and careful saving. Mikhail studied the money, then looked up at the woman. She had moved to the covered display and, with trembling hands, lifted the sheet. Beneath lay Elena's masterpiece, a wedding dress of ivory silk adorned with intricate beadwork that had taken months to complete. The bride who had commissioned it had died in a carriage accident before her wedding day, and Elena had never been able to bring herself to sell it. It had remained in the shop, a beautiful ghost of dreams unfulfilled. The woman's reaction was immediate and profound. She fell to her knees before the display, her massive frame shaking with silent sobs. She reached toward the dress, but stopped herself just short of touching the delicate fabric, as if she feared her rough hands might damage something so beautiful. In that moment, Mikhail saw past her size and circumstances to the heart of her desire. This was a woman who had never owned anything beautiful, never experienced the simple joy of feeling lovely. He approached her slowly, as one might approach a wounded animal. When he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, she looked up at him with eyes full of hope and fear in equal measure. She spoke again in her foreign tongue, the words tumbling out in a desperate rush. Though he couldn't understand the language, the emotion was universal. She was begging. Mikhail found himself nodding before he fully understood what he was agreeing to. The woman's face transformed, joy replacing desperation so quickly that it took his breath away. She stood and embraced him, her powerful arms lifting him clear off the ground. When she set him down, she was laughing and crying simultaneously, a sound that filled the shop with more life than it had seen in years. The practical challenges became immediately apparent. The dress, beautiful as it was, had been designed for a woman of average height and build. This woman would need something entirely different, something that honored her unique proportions while capturing the elegance she so clearly craved. Mikhail studied her form with a tailor's eye, already visualizing the modifications that would be necessary. He led her to the small fitting area at the back of the shop, gesturing for her to step behind the curtain. When she emerged, having removed her outer garments, Mikhail was struck again by the contradiction she presented. Her undergarments were rough and patched, but her skin was surprisingly soft, her posture naturally graceful despite her size. She was, he realized, quite young, perhaps in her early 20s. Measuring her required creativity. His standard measuring tape was far too short for her arm span, forcing him to use a longer rope and mark the measurements. Each dimension told a story of difference, of a life lived outside the normal parameters of society. Her height, her reach, the breadth of her shoulders, all spoke of genetics that had shaped her for a world that rarely accommodated such extremes. As he worked, the woman began to relax. She seemed to understand that he was taking her requests seriously, that he saw her not as a curiosity, but as a customer deserving of his best work. She began to speak more freely, and, though Mikhail couldn't understand her words, he found himself responding to her tone. There was intelligence in her voice, humor even. She laughed when he struggled to measure her height, reaching down to steady the stool he stood on. The coins she had brought were just enough to cover the cost of materials, with little left for labor. Under normal circumstances, Mikhail might have asked for more, but something about the woman's circumstances moved him. Perhaps it was the careful way she had counted out her money, or the obvious years of saving represented by that small pile of mixed currency. Perhaps it was simply that Elena would have wanted him to help her. He sketched quickly, showing her his vision for the dress. It would be white silk, as she clearly desired, but cut to accommodate her unique proportions. The sleeves would be full to balance her broad shoulders, the skirt flowing to emphasize her height rather than hide it. He showed her fabric samples, watching her eyes light up at the sight of the pure white silk he had been saving for a special commission. The woman studied the sketches with surprising comprehension, suggesting modifications with gestures and expressions that transcended language barriers. She wanted the neckline slightly lower, the waist positioned to flatter her long torso. Her suggestions showed an intuitive understanding of design that impressed Mikhail. This was not a simple woman, despite her circumstances. When they had settled on the design, she pressed the coins into his palm and spoke earnestly, pointing to herself and then to the calendar on his wall. 3 weeks, she seemed to be saying. She needed the dress in 3 weeks. Mikhail nodded, already calculating the time required for such a complex commission. She prepared to leave, gathering her patched coat and moving toward the door. At the threshold, she turned back and spoke a single word that sounded like a name, Anya. She pointed to herself and repeated it. Then, she pointed to him with a questioning expression. Mikhail, he replied, touching his chest. Her smile in response was radiant, transforming her entire face. She nodded formally, as if they had just concluded important business, then stepped out into the fog and disappeared as suddenly as she had arrived. Mikhail stood in his doorway for several minutes after she left, trying to process what had just occurred. In 30 years of tailoring, he had never encountered anyone quite like Anya. There was something otherworldly about her, something that suggested her story was far more complex than her appearance indicated. He returned to his workbench and began planning the dress. The measurements he had taken challenged everything he knew about garment construction. Creating something beautiful for a woman of Anya's proportions would require innovation, creativity, and a level of skill that would test his decades of experience. As he worked through the calculations, Mikhail found himself wondering about Anya's life. Where had she come from? What circumstances had led her to save so carefully for a wedding dress? And, perhaps most intriguingly, who was she planning to marry? The coin she had brought suggested travel from distant places, and her clothing indicated a life of hardship. Yet her demeanor spoke of education and intelligence. The white silk felt cool beneath his fingers as he began the initial cuts. Each snip of the scissors was deliberate, irreversible. There would be no room for error with fabric this expensive and a commission this unique. As he worked, Mikhail found himself thinking of Elena, imagining what she would have made of this unusual request. She had always believed that every woman deserved to feel beautiful on her wedding day, regardless of circumstances. The afternoon stretched into evening as Mikhail lost himself in the work. The bodice took shape slowly. Each seam carefully planned and executed. The sleeve construction required 3 attempts before he achieved the flowing elegance he envisioned. By lamplight, he worked on the intricate details that would make the dress special, the small touches that separated true craftsmanship from mere sewing. Days blended into one another as the dress consumed his attention. He found himself arriving at the shop earlier each morning, staying later each evening. The challenge of creating something beautiful for Anya had awakened a passion for his work that he hadn't felt since Elena's death. Each completed section brought satisfaction, but also raised new questions about the mysterious woman who had commissioned it. Neighbors began to comment on the long hours he was keeping, the lights burning in his shop well past normal closing time. Mikhail offered vague explanations about a special commission, but the truth was more complex. Working on Anya's dress had given him purpose beyond mere survival, something to look forward to each day. 2 weeks into the project, as Mikhail was hand-stitching delicate beadwork along the neckline, he noticed a figure watching his shop from across the street. A man, tall and lean, dressed in dark clothing that seemed to absorb the afternoon light. The watcher made no attempt to hide his presence, standing motionless for hours at a time. When Mikhail looked up from his work, the man would be there. When he looked again, the figure might be gone, only to reappear later from a different angle. The surveillance continued for 3 days, always the same silent figure or others like him. Mikhail began to feel uneasy, though he couldn't say exactly why. There was something predatory about the watchers, something that suggested they were more than casual observers. He found himself checking the locks on his doors more carefully, drawing the curtains earlier each evening. On the 4th day of being watched, Mikhail decided to confront the situation directly. He stepped outside during his lunch break and approached the spot where the latest watcher stood. The man was perhaps 40 years old, with weather-beaten features and eyes that seemed to see everything. He wore simple clothes that could have belonged to any working man, but there was something about his bearing that suggested otherwise. "Can I help you?" Mikhail asked in Romanian, then tried German, then Hungarian. The man regarded him with mild interest, but said nothing. His silence was somehow more unnerving than any threat might have been. After several minutes of futile attempts at communication, Mikhail returned to his shop, acutely aware of the man's eyes following his movement. The dress was nearly complete when Anya returned. Mikhail saw her approaching through the window, her distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the evening gloom. She moved with obvious excitement, her usual careful dignity replaced by an almost childlike eagerness. The bell above his door chimed enthusiastically as she burst through, her face bright with anticipation. "Mikhail!" she called, the only word of his language she seemed to know. He emerged from the back room, carrying the completed dress, carefully draped to hide the final result. Anya's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with wonder and disbelief. For a moment, she seemed afraid to move, as if sudden movement might cause the dress to disappear. He led her to the fitting area, hanging the dress carefully on the special hook he had installed to accommodate its length. Anya circled it slowly, taking in every detail of his work. The white silk caught the lamplight, seeming to glow from within. The beadwork Elena had started years ago sparkled like captured starlight. The flowing lines he had designed specifically for Anya's proportions created an elegance that transcended her unusual size. When she finally tried on the dress, the transformation was remarkable. The woman who had first entered his shop as a ragamuffin giant emerged from the fitting room as something approaching royalty. The silk moved with her as she walked, the careful tailoring accentuating her natural grace while minimizing the awkwardness her size might have suggested. She stood before the mirror, tears streaming down her face, and, for the first time since Elena's death, Mikhail felt the deep satisfaction of work perfectly executed. Anya spoke rapidly in her strange language, gesturing to herself, to him, to the dress. Though he couldn't understand the words, her gratitude was unmistakable. She knelt before him as she had that first day, but this time not in desperation. This time in thanks. As she prepared to leave, now carefully carrying the wrapped dress, Anya pressed something into Mikhail's hand. It was a small carving, made from what appeared to be bone or antler, depicting a figure that might have been a dancer or a warrior. The craftsmanship was exquisite, speaking of a culture that valued beauty alongside function. She spoke one last time, a long sentence that sounded almost formal, ceremonial. Then, she was gone, disappearing into the night with the same mysterious grace that had marked her first appearance. Mikhail stood in his doorway, holding the carving, watching until her figure vanished completely into the darkness. He had no way of knowing that he would never see Anya again, or that the watchers across the street had noted every detail of her visit. The dress he had created with such care and skill was about to become the center of a confrontation that would test everything he believed about courage, honor, and the unexpected consequences of simple kindness. 3 days after Anya's departure, Mikhail's peaceful routine was shattered forever. The morning began like any other, with fog drifting through the narrow streets and the familiar weight of solitude settling over his shoulders. He unlocked his shop, sorted through the day's simple alterations, and tried to ignore the persistent feeling that eyes were watching his every movement. The mysterious observers had multiplied since Anya's visit, their silent presence creating an atmosphere of tension that seemed to thicken with each passing hour. The first sign that something had fundamentally changed came with the customer who wasn't really a customer. She entered just after lunch, a woman of perhaps 35 with prematurely gray hair and clothes that marked her as neither wealthy nor poor. She browsed his fabric selections with apparent interest, running practiced fingers over various textures while engaging Mikhail in casual conversation about the upcoming winter season. Her Romanian was flawless, but something about her accent suggested it wasn't her native tongue. She asked intelligent questions about thread quality and garment care, displaying knowledge that went beyond casual interest. When she inquired about his recent work, specifically mentioning wedding dresses, Mikhail felt his first prickle of genuine alarm. "I heard you recently completed a very special commission," she said, her tone carefully neutral. Something quite unusual in its proportions. The craftsmanship must have been extraordinary to accommodate such unique requirements. Mikhail's hands stilled on the fabric he had been folding. "I'm afraid I don't discuss my customers' personal business," he replied carefully. "Privacy is essential in this profession." The woman smiled, but the expression didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, I understand completely, though I imagine it must have been challenging, creating something beautiful for someone so different. Tell me, did she seem satisfied with your work?" The directness of the question confirmed what Mikhail had begun to suspect. This was no casual inquiry about his services. Somehow, these people knew about Anya, knew about the dress, and were fishing for information he wasn't prepared to give. The protective instincts that had been building since the Watchers first appeared crystallized in his stubborn resolve. "I'm afraid I have no idea what you're referring to," he said firmly. "Now, if you're not planning to purchase anything, I have work to attend to." The woman's facade dropped completely. Her posture straightened, and suddenly, she seemed larger, more dangerous. "Mr. Petrov, you would be wise to reconsider your discretion. The people I represent have traveled very far to find the woman you helped. Your cooperation would be appreciated." Before Mikhail could respond, The shop door opened, and two men entered. They moved with the fluid coordination of people accustomed to working together, immediately positioning themselves to block any potential escape routes. Like the woman, they appeared to be in their 30s, with the weathered faces and economical movements of people who spent their lives outdoors. Their clothing was simple, but well-made, practical rather than decorative. "Perhaps we should speak more privately," the woman suggested, her tone making it clear this wasn't really a suggestion. Mikhail found himself guided to his small office behind the main shop, his mind racing to understand the situation he had stumbled into. These people weren't common criminals or local authorities. They moved with military precision and spoke with the confidence of individuals accustomed to getting what they wanted. More troubling still was their obvious familiarity with Anya's unusual appearance. How many 7-foot-tall women could there be in Eastern Europe? The office felt smaller with 4 people crowded inside, the walls seeming to press inward as the interrogation began in earnest. The woman, who introduced herself only as Mira, pulled out a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be maps and photographs. She spread them across Mikhail's desk with the efficiency of someone conducting a briefing. "We know she was here 3 weeks ago," Mira began, pointing to a photograph that made Mikhail's blood run cold. It showed Anya standing outside his shop, her distinctive silhouette unmistakable even in the grainy black and white image. "We know she paid you to create something special for her. We know she returned exactly as promised to collect it." The photographs continued, a detailed record of surveillance that chilled Mikhail to his core. Images of Anya approaching the shop, entering and leaving, even one taken through his window showing her trying on a partially completed dress. These people had been watching for weeks, documenting everything while he remained obliviously focused on his work. "What we don't know," Mira continued, "is where she went afterward. This is information we require, and which we believe you can provide." Mikhail studied the woman's face, searching for some clue about her motivations. "I don't know where she went. She collected the dress and left. That's the extent of our interaction." One of the men, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. When he spoke, his accent was different from Myra's, suggesting these people represented some kind of international effort. "Mr. Petrov, you must understand that this woman is extremely dangerous. She has committed terrible crimes, hurt innocent people. By helping her, you may have unknowingly aided a fugitive." The words hit Mikhail like a physical blow. Dangerous? The woman who had knelt before him in gratitude, who had handled his delicate fabrics with such careful reverence. The idea seemed impossible, yet the serious expressions of his interrogators suggested they genuinely believed what they were saying. "What crimes?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mira exchanged glances with her companions before responding. "Murder, Mr. Petrov. Multiple murders. She killed 3 members of a family in Hungary, then disappeared into the mountains. We've been tracking her for months." The room spun slightly as Mikhail processed this information. The gentle giant who had saved coins for a wedding dress was a killer? The woman whose eyes had filled with tears at the sight of white silk was capable of murder? Every instinct he possessed rejected the accusation, yet these people seemed utterly convinced of its truth. "I don't believe you," he said finally, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "The woman I met was gentle, grateful. She couldn't hurt anyone." The second man, broader and more threatening than his companion, moved closer to Mikhail's chair. "Appearances can be deceiving, old man. Size and strength like hers can kill without effort. The family she murdered, they thought she was harmless too." Mira spread out additional photographs, crime scene images that made Mikhail's stomach lurch. Bodies arranged in positions that suggested violence beyond anything he could imagine. Bloodstains on floors, overturned furniture, the unmistakable evidence of a struggle that had ended badly for its victims. "This is what your gentle customer is capable of," she said coldly. "Still feel inclined to protect her?" Mikhail stared at the images, his mind rejecting what his eyes were showing him. The woman in the photographs bore no resemblance to the Anya he had known. That woman had been careful with his fabrics, respectful of his space, overwhelmed with joy at something as simple as a beautiful dress. How could someone capable of such tenderness also be capable of this brutality? "Why do you need to find her?" he asked, his voice shaking. "If she's such a killer, why not simply contact the local police?" Myra's expression hardened. "This goes beyond local law enforcement. She's part of something larger, something that requires specialists to handle properly." Where did she go after leaving your shop? The pressure in the room was becoming unbearable, the walls seeming to close in as 3 pairs of eyes focused on him with laser intensity. Mikhail felt sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool autumn air filtering through his window. These people weren't going to leave until they got what they wanted, and their growing impatience suggested that purely verbal intimidation might not remain their only tactic. I truly don't know, he insisted. She came. She collected the dress. She left. She never mentioned where she was going or why she needed the dress. Our communication was limited by language barriers. The broader man moved behind Mikhail's chair, his presence looming like a storm cloud. Perhaps your memory needs encouragement, he suggested, his tone carrying unmistakable menace. Before the situation could escalate further, the shop's front bell chimed, announcing a new arrival. Mira gestured sharply to her companions, and all 3 moved with practiced efficiency. The men positioned themselves where they could see both Mikhail and the shop entrance while remaining partially hidden, while Mira quickly gathered her photographs and maps. Answer normally, she whispered to Mikhail. Any attempt to signal for help will end badly for everyone involved. The customer turned out to be Mrs. Popescu, an elderly woman who brought Mikhail simple mending work twice a month. She moved slowly through the shop, her cane tapping against the wooden floor as she examined the progress on her husband's winter coat. Her presence, so normal and predictable, felt surreal against the backdrop of international intrigue and accusations of murder. Mikhail found himself functioning on autopilot, discussing button replacements and hemline adjustments while his mind reeled from everything he had just learned. Mrs. Popescu seemed satisfied with his work, paid her small fee, and left with promises to return the following week. Her departure felt like the closing of a door between 2 different worlds. The moment she was gone, the interrogation resumed with renewed intensity. Mira spread her materials across his workbench this time, using the larger surface to display additional evidence of Anya's alleged crimes. More photographs, documents in languages Mikhail couldn't read, maps marked with red symbols that suggested a pattern of movement across Central and Eastern Europe. This has been going on for over a year, she explained, tracing routes across the map with her finger. Always the same pattern. She appears in a small town or village, stays for a few days or weeks, then violence erupts and she disappears. The wedding dress represents a new development in her behavior, something that suggests she's planning to settle somewhere permanently. The timeline troubled Mikhail more than he cared to admit. If what these people claimed was true, then Anya had been killing while simultaneously saving money for a wedding dress. The contradiction seemed impossible to reconcile. How could someone plan a wedding, symbol of hope and new beginnings, while leaving a trail of corpses across half of Europe? Perhaps she's been falsely accused, he suggested, grasping for any explanation that would preserve his faith in his own judgment. Maybe she's running from the real killers. Myra's laugh was bitter and humorless. Mr. Petrov, we have witnesses, people who saw her commit these crimes. Her size makes her impossible to mistake for anyone else. How many 7-foot-tall women do you suppose there are in this part of the world? The question echoed his own earlier thoughts, driving home the horrible logic of their accusation. Anya's distinctive appearance, which had made her so memorable as a customer, would also make her impossible to misidentify as a criminal. If witnesses claimed to have seen someone of her description committing murder, the likelihood of mistaken identity was virtually non-existent. The afternoon stretched into evening as the interrogation continued, each new piece of evidence adding weight to the case against Anya. Financial records showing money stolen from victims that matched some of the coins she had used to pay for the dress. Descriptions from survivors that perfectly matched her appearance and manner of dress. Timeline correlations that placed her in the vicinity of each crime during the appropriate window. By the time darkness fell outside his windows, Mikhail found his certainty crumbling. The evidence was overwhelming, presented by people who clearly knew their business and had no obvious reason to lie. Yet some part of him continued to resist, clinging to the memory of Anya's tears of joy when she saw the completed dress. Assuming everything you've told me is true, he said finally, I still don't know where she went. She never mentioned plans beyond collecting the dress. If I had to guess, I'd say she was planning to meet someone for a wedding ceremony, but she gave no indication of where or when. Mira studied his face intently, as if searching for signs of deception. After a long moment, she seemed to reach a conclusion. We believe you're telling the truth about not knowing her destination. However, we also believe you may know more than you realize. Think carefully about everything she said or did. Any gesture, any expression, anything that might provide a clue. The hours that followed were exhausting, as Mikhail was forced to relive every moment of his interactions with Anya in excruciating detail. The interrogators were skilled at their work, asking the same questions from different angles, looking for inconsistencies or forgotten details that might prove useful. They were particularly interested in the carving she had given him, examining it closely and photographing it from multiple angles. This style of craftsmanship, Mira noted, it's from the northern mountains, probably somewhere along the Romanian-Ukrainian border. It confirms that she's been moving through traditional rural areas rather than cities. As the evening wore on, Mikhail began to understand that his ordeal was far from over. These people had no intention of simply collecting their information and leaving. They were setting up what appeared to be a permanent surveillance operation, using his shop as a base of operations while they waited for Anya to make contact or return for some reason. The broader man, who introduced himself only as Victor, began installing listening equipment with practiced efficiency. Small microphones were hidden throughout the shop, connected to recording devices that would capture any conversation that took place within building. A camera was positioned to monitor the entrance, its lens so small as to be virtually undetectable. You will continue your normal routine, Mira instructed. Serve your customers, conduct your business, but remain alert for any sign that she might return or attempt to contact you. We'll be watching, and we'll know if you try to warn her. The implied threat was clear enough, but Mira made it explicit anyway. Mr. Petrov, you seem like a decent man who was simply trying to help someone he believed was in need. We have no desire to see you harmed. However, harboring a dangerous fugitive is a serious crime in any jurisdiction. Cooperation ensures your safety. Resistance guarantees problems you cannot imagine. As his unwanted guests finally prepared to leave, Mikhail felt the weight of his situation settling over him like a burial shroud. His peaceful life had been shattered by a simple act of kindness, and now he found himself trapped in the middle of an international manhunt. Whether Anya was guilty or innocent had become almost irrelevant. The hunters had found his scent, and they weren't going away until they had their prey. The shop felt different after they left, contaminated by their presence and the surveillance equipment they had installed. Every familiar surface now seemed to hide potential threats. Every shadow might conceal a watcher. Mikhail moved through his evening routine like a sleepwalker, mechanically locking doors and turning off lights while his mind struggled to process everything that had happened. Sleep proved elusive that night. He lay in his small apartment above the shop, staring at the ceiling and wondering how a simple wedding dress commission had evolved into this nightmare. Somewhere out there, Anya was probably preparing for her wedding, unaware that an international team of hunters was closing in on her location. The dress he had crafted with such care was about to become evidence in a case that could see her imprisoned or worse. The irony was bitter. He had created something beautiful for a woman he believed deserved happiness, only to discover that she might be a monster wearing the face of an angel. Or perhaps she was exactly what she had seemed, and he was being manipulated by people with their own agenda. In the darkness of his bedroom, with surveillance equipment humming softly in the shop below, Mikhail realized that the truth might be far more complex than either possibility suggested. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, and the terrible burden of knowledge that could destroy an innocent woman or help capture a killer. Either way, the simple life he had known was gone forever, replaced by something infinitely more dangerous and uncertain. The white wedding dress, symbol of purity and new beginnings, had become the centerpiece of a drama that threatened to consume everyone it touched. And somewhere in the mountains, warriors were gathering for a wedding that would change everything. High in the Carpathian Mountains, where ancient peaks pierced the sky like broken teeth, and forests stretch endlessly toward horizons lost in mist, a wedding unlike any other was about to take place. The location chosen by Anya's people was sacred ground, a circular clearing surrounded by standing stones that had witnessed ceremonies for over 1,000 years. Here, where the boundary between the modern world and ancient traditions grew thin as morning fog, two worlds were preparing to collide in ways that none of the participants could fully foresee. Anya stood at the edge of the clearing, wrapped in a thick woolen cloak that concealed the white dress beneath. Around her, members of her clan moved with purposeful efficiency, preparing for a ceremony that would unite not just two people, but two powerful families whose alliance could reshape the balance of power throughout the remote mountain regions. These are not simple villagers or ordinary farmers. They were the descendants of warrior peoples who had retreated into the high places when the modern world became too small to contain their ancient ways. The men preparing the ceremonial space were giants by any standard, none standing less than 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to carry entire tree trunks and hands that could crush stone. Yet they moved with surprising grace as they arranged massive logs into precise configurations, built fires that would burn throughout the night, and positioned traditional banners that told stories of victories won and honors earned across countless generations. Their women were equally impressive, tall, and strong, with eyes that missed nothing and voices that could carry across mountain valleys. They prepared foods that required days of preparation, weaving together flavors and traditions that connected the celebration to festivals celebrated by their ancestors before written history began. The wedding feast would honor not just Anya and her chosen partner, but the long chain of couples who had come before them. At the center of the clearing stood the altar stone, a massive granite boulder carved with symbols that predated Christianity by centuries. Upon its surface lay items that would play crucial roles in the ceremony. Ancient weapons that symbolized protection, vessels carved from mountain crystals that would hold ceremonial wine, and sacred texts written on leather scrolls that recorded the genealogies and achievements of both families involved in the union. Anya's betrothed was a man called Dmitri, chief of a clan that controlled the mountain passes between Romania and Ukraine. Like Anya, he was a giant among giants, standing nearly 8 feet tall with arms like tree branches and a presence that commanded respect from everyone around him. His beard, black as winter nights, had been braided with silver threads for the ceremony, and his wedding clothes were decorated with intricate patterns that told the story of his lineage. The courtship between Anya and Dmitri had followed traditions as old as the mountains themselves. Their families had negotiated for months, exchanging gifts and stories, establishing the terms of an alliance that would unite two of the most powerful clans in the region. The marriage was as much about politics and survival as it was about love, though the careful observer could see genuine affection growing between the two young leaders. For Anya, this wedding represented the culmination of a journey that had taken her far from the safety of the mountains and into a world that often regarded her as a curiosity or a threat. The white dress hidden beneath her cloak was more than mere clothing. It was a symbol of her determination to claim the same happiness that women in the outside world took for granted. She had dreamed of wearing something beautiful on her wedding day, something that would make her feel worthy of the ceremony and the man she was about to marry. The dress itself had become almost legendary among her people. Word of the kindly tailor who had created something magnificent for their beloved Anya had spread quickly through the clan networks that connected the scattered mountain communities. The story had grown in the telling, becoming part of the oral tradition that preserved important events for future generations. As the sun climbed higher, more members of both clans continued to arrive at the clearing. They came on foot along paths known only to their people, carrying weapons and supplies for what would be a 3-day celebration. Some had traveled for weeks to attend, crossing mountain ranges and navigating political boundaries that meant little to people who recognized older, deeper loyalties. The arriving guests brought gifts that reflected their unique culture and values. Hand-forged weapons that took master craftsmen months to complete. Jewelry carved from materials found only in the deepest caves. Tapestries that told stories of great hunts and greater battles. Each gift was presented with formal speeches that connected the offering to specific achievements or relationships, weaving the wedding into the larger narrative of clan history. Among the arriving guests were the warriors who served as the military backbone of both clans. These were men and women who had trained from childhood in the arts of mountain warfare, who could move through the most difficult terrain without leaving tracks, who could survive for weeks with nothing but what they carried on their backs. Their presence at the wedding served multiple purposes, celebrating the union while also providing security against the various threats that constantly faced their people. The threats were real and numerous. Government forces from multiple countries regarded the mountain clans as anachronisms at best, criminals at worst. Their refusal to fully integrate into modern society, their maintenance of traditional territorial boundaries that ignored national borders, and their occasional conflicts with lowland authorities had made them targets for various law enforcement agencies. The wedding celebration, with its concentration of clan leadership, represented both an opportunity for enemy action and a necessary display of unity. As afternoon approached, the formal preparations began in earnest. Anya was escorted to a sacred grove where the women of both families would help her prepare for the ceremony. The grove had been used for bridal preparations for centuries, its ancient trees bearing carved symbols that recorded the names and dates of countless previous weddings. The continuity of tradition was important to these people, connecting each new union to the long chain of relationships that had sustained their culture through wars, famines, and the endless pressure of a changing world. The preparation ritual was elaborate and meaningful, each step carrying symbolic weight that connected Anya to the women who had come before her. Her hair, usually worn in a simple braid, was arranged in complex patterns that indicated her status as both clan leader and bride. Traditional ornaments, passed down through generations, were woven into the styling to ensure that the spirits of her ancestors would be present during the ceremony. The white dress, when finally revealed, drew gasps of appreciation from the assembled women. Mikhail's craftsmanship was evident in every line and curve, the silk flowing like water over Anya's unique proportions. The beadwork caught the dappled sunlight filtering through the trees, creating patterns of light that seemed to dance across the fabric. For many of the older women, who had never seen anything quite like it, the dress represented a bridge between their traditional world and the possibilities that lay beyond the mountains. The younger women were particularly fascinated by the dress's construction, examining the innovative techniques Mikhail had used to accommodate Anya's size while maintaining elegance and grace. Several announced their intention to seek out the talented tailor when their own wedding days arrived, not realizing that their beloved Anya's visit to his shop had already set in motion events that would make such future visits impossible. As Anya was being prepared, Dmitri underwent his own traditional preparations in a different part of the clearing. The men of both families gathered around him, sharing stories of their own weddings and offering advice that ranged from practical to profoundly philosophical. The ritual consumption of ceremonial mead, brewed specifically for the occasion, began the formal process of accepting him into the extended family network that would define the rest of his life. The weapons ceremony, one of the most important elements of mountain wedding traditions, required Dmitri to formally present arms that would symbolize his commitment to protecting not just his bride, but all members of her clan. The weapons themselves were works of art, forged by master smiths using techniques passed down through countless generations. Each blade, each hammer, each bow was blessed by the clan elders and inscribed with protective symbols that would bind Dmitri to his responsibilities as both husband and warrior. The political implications of the wedding were never far from anyone's mind. The union between Anya and Dmitri would create a military alliance capable of controlling trade routes that had been disputed for decades. Their combined clans could field nearly 300 warriors, making them a formidable force in regional politics. The celebration was as much about demonstrating this power as it was about celebrating love and commitment. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, the formal ceremony finally began. The participants formed concentric circles around the altar stone, with the eldest members of both families closest to the center and the youngest warriors forming the outer perimeter. The arrangement was both symbolic and practical, honoring age and wisdom while positioning the community's defenders where they could best respond to any potential threats. The ceremony itself blended elements from Christianity with traditions that were far older, creating a unique synthesis that reflected the complex history of the mountain peoples. Ancient words and languages that had been spoken in these valleys long before Latin arrived were mixed with prayers that would have been familiar to any Orthodox priest. The result was something that satisfied both the spiritual needs of the participants and the requirements of their ancestors. Anya's entrance into the ceremonial circle was a moment of pure magic. The white dress, so carefully crafted by Mikhail's skilled hands, transformed her from the chief of a mountain clan into something approaching divinity. The silk moved with her as she walked, catching the light from the ceremonial fires and reflecting it back in patterns that seemed to have their own life. The gathered warriors, men and women who had faced death without flinching, found themselves moved to tears by the sight of their beloved leader claiming her moment of perfect happiness. Dimitri's response to seeing his bride was immediate and profound. This giant of a man, who commanded respect through his strength and wisdom, was visibly overcome by Anya's beauty and dignity. The traditional exchange of vows, spoken in the ancient language of their people, took on new meaning when delivered by two people who genuinely cared for each other despite the political necessities that had brought them together. The ritual exchange of gifts marked the formal joining of the two clans. Weapons, jewelry, and sacred objects passed from one family to the other, each transfer accompanied by speeches that established new relationships and obligations. The complexity of the gift exchange reflected the intricate web of loyalties and dependencies that would define the merged clan structure for generations to come. The feast that followed the ceremony was a celebration of abundance that seemed to defy the harsh realities of mountain life. Game that had been hunted specifically for the occasion was prepared using techniques that enhanced both flavor and symbolic meaning. Wild boar represented strength and determination. Mountain deer symbolized grace and wisdom. Fish caught from the highest alpine lakes carried the blessing of the ancient spirits that were said to dwell in those remote waters. The traditional wedding dances began as the full moon rose over the peaks, casting silver light across the clearing that had witnessed so many similar celebrations. The dances told stories of courtship and marriage, of battles won and children born, of the endless cycle of life that connected each generation to those who had come before. Anya and Dimitri led the dancing, their movements synchronized in patterns that spoke of partnership and mutual respect. As the celebration reached its peak, with fires burning high and voices raised in ancient songs, none of the participants could have imagined that their joy was about to be shattered by forces they had never encountered before. The white dress that had brought such happiness to Anya was already serving as evidence in an investigation that would soon bring armed strangers into their sacred space. Far below, in the valleys, modern technology was tracking their location through methods that their traditional knowledge could not have anticipated. The hunters who had interrogated Mikhail were closing in, following trails that led inexorably toward the mountainous celebration. The collision between ancient ways and modern enforcement was about to transform a wedding celebration into something far more dangerous. But for now, in this moment of perfect happiness, Anya danced with her new husband under stars that had witnessed 1,000 years of similar celebrations. The white dress moved around her like captured moonlight, and for a few precious hours, she was exactly what she had always dreamed of being, a bride surrounded by love, wearing something beautiful, claiming her place in the long tradition of women who had found happiness despite the harshness of the world around them. The mountain spirits, if they existed, must have looked down on the celebration with satisfaction. The old ways were being honored, the new generation was taking their place in the eternal cycle, and the future seemed bright with possibility. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight belonged to joy, to tradition, and to the simple human desire for happiness that transcends all boundaries of culture and circumstance. The hunters arrived at dawn, when the wedding celebration was at its most vulnerable moment. The all-night festivities had left many of the warriors exhausted, their usual alertness dulled by ceremonial wine and the euphoria of successful celebration. The attack came not as a frontal assault, which would have been suicide against such formidable opponents, but as a carefully orchestrated operation designed to capture rather than kill, to separate rather than destroy. Mira led a team of 20 specialists who had been tracking the mountain clans for months, gathering intelligence about their customs, their movements, and their weaknesses. The wedding celebration had provided exactly the opportunity they needed, a gathering large enough to include most of the regional leadership, isolated enough to prevent easy escape, and time to coincide with the maximum likelihood of reduced defensive readiness. The encirclement began while the last dancers were still swaying around the dying embers of the ceremonial fires. Reconnaissance teams equipped with night vision and advanced communications equipment moved into position along the mountain ridges surrounding the clearing. Each team carried weapons designed for non-lethal capture, tranquilizer rifles, flashbang grenades, and restraint equipment capable of immobilizing even the largest of their targets. The operation represented months of careful planning and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. What had begun as a simple manhunt for a suspected killer had evolved into something far more ambitious, an attempt to neutralize what governments increasingly viewed as a threat to regional stability. The mountain clans, with their refusal to recognize modern borders and their maintenance of autonomous military capabilities, had become anachronisms that no longer fitted the requirements of 21st century nation-states. Anya woke first, her instincts still sharp despite the previous night's celebration. Something in the quality of the morning silence troubled her, a subtle wrongness that spoke of danger lurking just beyond perception. She rose quietly from the traditional wedding bed that had been prepared in a sacred grove adjacent to the main clearing, careful not to disturb Dmitri, who slept peacefully beside her. The white dress lay carefully folded nearby, too precious to risk damaging during the night's more intimate celebrations. Anya had changed into simpler clothes for the final hours of the wedding festivities, but the sight of the silk gown still filled her with warmth. It represented so much more than mere clothing. It was proof that beauty existed in the world beyond her mountains, that kindness could be found in unexpected places, that even someone like her could claim moments of perfect happiness. Her unease growing stronger with each passing moment, Anya moved silently through the grove toward the main clearing. The warriors who should have been maintaining watch positions were nowhere to be seen, and the usual sounds of early morning activity were ominously absent. The hair on the back of her neck rose as primitive warning systems inherited from countless generations of mountain dwellers signaled immediate and overwhelming danger. The attack began with a series of coordinated strikes designed to disable the clan's leadership before organized resistance could develop. Tranquilizer darts found their targets among the sleeping warriors, dropping them into unconsciousness before they could sound alarms or reach their weapons. The few sentries who had remained alert were neutralized by specialists who had spent years perfecting the art of silent elimination. Dmitri was captured in his sleep, the powerful sedatives taking effect before his legendary strength could be brought to bear. Elite operators equipped with restraint systems designed specifically for targets of unusual size secured him while he was still unconscious, ensuring that when he eventually woke, he would be completely helpless. The other clan leaders fell in similar fashion, victims of intelligence gathering that had identified each individual's sleeping arrangements and personal habits. The months of surveillance had paid enormous dividends, allowing the hunters to strike with surgical precision at the heart of the mountain clan's command structure. Anya managed to avoid the initial wave of captures through a combination of instinct and luck. Her position in the sacred grove, slightly removed from the main sleeping areas, gave her precious seconds to recognize what was happening and react accordingly. Years of training in mountain warfare served her well as she moved through the forest like a shadow, avoiding detection while desperately trying to understand the scope of the disaster unfolding around her. From her concealed position, she could see armed figures moving through the clearing with military efficiency. These weren't local police or even regular military forces. Their equipment, their movements, their coordination all spoke of specialized training and substantial resources. Someone had invested heavily in this operation, planning it with a level of detail that suggested intimate knowledge of her people's customs and capabilities. The realization that this was specifically about her came with a shock that nearly paralyzed her with its implications. These hunters hadn't come for the clans in general, or even for the weapons and political autonomy that mountain people represented. They had come for Anya specifically, following a trail that somehow led back to her visit to Mikhail's shop and the creation of her wedding dress. The terrible irony wasn't lost on her. The most beautiful day of her life was being destroyed because she had dared to want something beyond the harsh necessities of mountain survival. Her innocent desire for a wedding dress, her brief venture into the outside world, had somehow marked her as a target for forces she couldn't fully understand. Moving with the stealth that had made her clan's warriors legendary, Anya worked her way back toward the sacred grove where her most precious possessions remained. The white dress called to her like a beacon, representing not just personal happiness, but a connection to the kindly tailor who had shown her such unexpected compassion. If she was about to lose everything else, she would at least save the one thing that proved beauty could exist in a harsh world. The grove had not yet been searched, the hunters apparently focusing their initial efforts on capturing the major leadership targets. Anya found the dress where she had left it, the silk still pristine and beautiful despite the chaos erupting around it. She gathered it carefully, along with a few other items that held deep personal significance. Weapons that had belonged to her father, jewelry that connected her to generations of clan mothers, and the small carving that mythical had admired during their final meeting. Escape from the immediate area required every skill she had learned during years of mountain warfare. The hunters had positioned themselves to prevent exactly what she was attempting, but their knowledge of mountain terrain, while extensive, couldn't match the lifetime of experience that allowed her to move through impossible terrain without leaving tracks. She climbed paths that barely qualified as such, using handholds that would challenge experienced mountaineers, moving always upward toward peaks where the air grew thin and the cold could kill unprepared travelers. Behind her, the sounds of the operation continued as more clan members were captured and secured for transport to whatever fate awaited them. The climb took hours, her progress slowed by the need to remain invisible while carrying the precious burden of her wedding dress and other irreplaceable possessions. Several times, she was forced to hide in caves or behind rock formations as search teams passed nearby, their voices carried on the mountain winds with fragments of conversation that revealed their determination to capture her specifically. By afternoon, Anya had reached a position high enough to survey the entire operation unfolding below. The scope of the disaster was even worse than she had feared. Dozens of her people had been captured, loaded into vehicles that would carry them away from the mountains that had been their home for countless generations. The sacred clearing, site of so many ceremonies and celebrations, was being systematically searched and documented by strangers who had no understanding of its spiritual significance. The wedding that had begun with such joy had become a trap that had snared not just her new husband, but most of the leadership of both clans. The political alliance that should have strengthened her people had instead delivered them into the hands of their enemies. The white dress that had symbolized hope and happiness was now the only tangible reminder of dreams that had been shattered beyond repair. From her high vantage point, Anya could see the hunters beginning to expand their search patterns, moving methodically outward from the clearing and formations designed to prevent any escape. They had come prepared for a long operation, with supply lines and communication networks that spoke of substantial government backing. This wasn't a simple police action, but something approaching a military campaign. The radio communications she could intercept revealed coordination between multiple agencies and jurisdictions. References to international cooperation, intelligence sharing, and classified threat assessments painted a picture of her people being viewed as something far more dangerous than simple mountain dwellers who wanted to be left alone. As evening approached, Anya made the heartbreaking decision to retreat deeper into the mountains rather than attempt a rescue that would almost certainly result in her own capture. The logical part of her mind recognized that her people needed her to remain free if there was any hope of eventually securing their release. The emotional part simply couldn't bear to abandon her new husband and clan family to whatever fate awaited them. The night that followed was among the longest of her life, spent in a cave so high and remote that the air was barely breathable. The white dress lay beside her, its beauty intact, but its meaning forever changed. What had been a symbol of joy and new beginnings had become a reminder of loss and betrayal, evidence of how innocent dreams could become weapons in the hands of those who sought to destroy everything she held dear. Sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of Mikhail's shop, of the kindly old tailor who had treated her with such dignity and respect. In her dreams, the surveillance equipment was visible, the hidden watchers revealed, the trap that had been set from the moment she first entered his shop laid bare in all its calculated cruelty. Dawn brought the sound of helicopters, their mechanical thunder echoing off mountain peaks as the search for her intensified. The hunters were bringing additional resources to bear, expanding their operation until it resembled a full-scale military campaign. They clearly had no intention of allowing her to escape, no matter what the cost in time and personnel. But Anya was in her element now, moving through terrain that had shaped her people for generations. The mountains that seemed so hostile to outsiders were home to her, every peak and valley as familiar as her own heartbeat. If the hunters wanted to find her here, They would discover what mountain warfare really meant when fought by someone who had been born to these heights. The white dress went with her as she began the long journey deeper into the Carpathians, toward refuges known only to her people, where ancient traditions of resistance could be awakened once more. The wedding celebration was over, transformed into something that would echo through clan memory for generations. But the war that had begun with such innocent intentions was just beginning. Behind her, the sacred clearing lay empty except for the evidence teams still cataloging everything they could find. The altar stone, which had witnessed centuries of ceremonies, was being photographed and measured as if it were a crime scene. The fires that had burned for the wedding celebration were cold ash, scattered by winds that carried the scent of change, and lost across valleys that had known such upheavals before. The hunt was far from over, but the prey had escaped in a country where the advantage shifted decisively to those who belonged there. In the thin air of the high peaks, carrying her wedding dress like a battle standard, Anya began to plan not just for survival, but for the rescue of her people and the preservation of traditions that had survived every previous attempt at destruction. 3 months after the wedding raid, Mikhail sat in his shop, trying to pretend that life had returned to normal. The surveillance equipment had been removed, the watchers had disappeared, and his daily routine had resumed its familiar patterns. Yet everything felt different, contaminated by knowledge he couldn't unlearn and guilt he couldn't escape. The brass bell above his door still chimed when customers entered, but the sound now reminded him of warning alarms rather than welcoming greetings. The official story, delivered by Mira during her final visit to collect her equipment, was that the operation had been a complete success. Anya had been captured along with most of her criminal network, ending a reign of terror that had claimed dozens of innocent lives across Eastern Europe. The mountain clans had been disbanded, their members relocated to supervised communities where they could be properly monitored and gradually integrated into modern society. But Mikhail's instincts, honed by 62 years of reading people and situations, told him that something was fundamentally wrong with this narrative. The satisfaction that should have accompanied such a successful conclusion was notably absent from Myra's demeanor. Her final briefing had the quality of a performance rather than a genuine report, as if she were reciting lines rather than sharing actual experiences. The first crack in the official story came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Popescu, the elderly woman whose husband's coat repairs had interrupted Anya's interrogation. She arrived on a gray November morning, carrying news that would shatter everything Mikhail thought he knew about recent events. "Such terrible things happening in the mountains," she said, settling into the chair beside his workbench with the careful movements of advanced age. "My nephew worked for the border patrol, you know. He says they found evidence of a massacre up in the Carpathians. Dozens of people killed, but the government is covering it up for some reason." Mikhail's hands stilled on the fabric he was cutting. "A massacre? Bodies everywhere," he told me. "Men, women, even children. Shot down like animals during some kind of celebration. The official reports say it was a terrorist training camp, but my nephew saw the scene himself. Wedding decorations," he said. "Festival preparations. These weren't terrorists, they were families." The blood drained from Mikhail's face as the implications hit him. The wedding celebration he had helped enable through his creation of Anya's dress had become the site of a slaughter. The gentle giant who had knelt before him in gratitude was either dead or witness to the destruction of everything she held dear. Mrs. Popescu continued her account, unaware of the devastation her words were causing. "The strangest part is what they did with the bodies. Instead of proper burials, they were taken away in trucks. My nephew thinks they were disposed of secretly to hide the evidence of what really happened up there." That evening, Mikhail stood in his empty shop wrestling with a truth too horrible to fully comprehend. The interrogation, the surveillance, the careful gathering of information about Anya's location, none of it had been about capturing a dangerous criminal. It had been about locating a wedding celebration so that it could be attacked and its participants eliminated. The realization that he had been manipulated into enabling a massacre was almost too much to bear. His innocent cooperation with the hunters, his belief in their claims about Anya's criminality, had directly contributed to the deaths of dozens of people whose only crime had been celebrating love and tradition in ways that threatened no one. The photographs Mira had shown him, the evidence of brutal murders supposedly committed by Anya, took on new meaning in light of this revelation. Those crime scenes hadn't been created by a rampaging giant. They had been manufactured by the same people who had conducted the mountain raid, designed to provide justification for an operation that had been planned long before Anya ever entered his shop. Sleep became impossible as Mikhail was haunted by images of Anya in her white dress, surrounded by family and friends who had trusted him enough to believe in her safety. The silk gown he had crafted with such care had become her burial shroud. The beauty he had created transformed into a beacon that had guided death directly to its target. The guilt was overwhelming, but beneath it grew something harder and more dangerous: anger. He had been used by people who had cynically exploited his natural desire to help someone in need. His shop had been turned into a trap, his kindness weaponized against innocent people who had done nothing more threatening than maintain their traditional way of life. Winter deepened, and with it came additional fragments of truth that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of the forces behind the mountain operation. A customer mentioned seeing unusual military activity near the Romanian border. Another spoke of refugee camps being established for displaced mountain peoples, though no one seemed to know exactly what had displaced them. Most revealing was a conversation overheard in the local tavern between two men who clearly didn't realize their voices carried. They spoke of international pressure to eliminate the autonomous zones that had existed in the Carpathians for centuries, of modernization efforts that required the removal of populations who refused to integrate with contemporary governmental structures. The mountain clans, Mikhail gradually understood, had been targeted not because they were criminals, but because they represented an alternative to the total state control that modern governments demanded. Their ability to exist independently, to maintain their own justice systems and territorial boundaries, made them an intolerable challenge to authorities who claimed absolute jurisdiction over every square meter of their nations. Anya's wedding dress had provided the perfect excuse for an operation that had been inevitable regardless of any individual actions. The hunters had simply waited for an opportunity to locate a major gathering, then manufactured whatever justification was necessary to attack it. If Anya hadn't commissioned a wedding dress, they would have found some other way to track the celebration. Spring arrived with news that confirmed Mikhail's worst fears. A traveling merchant, one of the few people who still traded with the scattered mountain communities, brought word that no survivors of the wedding massacre had ever been found. The entire celebration, including all the guests who had traveled from distant clans, had been wiped out in a single night of coordinated violence. They say there was one who escaped, the merchant whispered, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard. A woman, huge like a tree, carrying something white. The soldiers hunted her for months, but never found her. Something she died in the mountains. Others believe she's still out there, planning revenge for what was done to her people. The image of Anya alone in the wilderness, carrying her wedding dress like a flag of mourning, was almost more than Mikhail could bear. The woman who had trusted him enough to save her coins and commission something beautiful was wandering the mountains as the sole survivor of a genocide disguised as law enforcement. That night, Mikhail made a decision that would define the remainder of his life. He could not undo what had been done, could not restore the lives that had been lost through his unwitting cooperation. But he could ensure that the truth of what had happened would not disappear with him. He began writing, documenting everything he could remember about the hunters, their methods, their claims, and the obvious lies that had justified their operation. The account grew night by night as he recalled details that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now formed a pattern of deception and manipulation. The writing became a form of penance, a way of honoring the memory of people he had never met but whose deaths he had inadvertently helped enable. Each page was a small act of rebellion against the forces that had used him, a refusal to let their crimes remain hidden forever. As summer approached, bringing with it the anniversary of Anya's first visit to his shop, Mikhail received a visitor who changed everything once again. She appeared at closing time, moving through the evening shadows with a caution that spoke of hard-won survival skills. When she stepped into the light cast by a shop window, Mikhail's heart nearly stopped. It was Anya, but transformed by months of hardship and loss. She had lost weight, her massive frame now lean and dangerous rather than gentle. Her clothes were practical mountain gear, designed for concealment and survival. Most striking were her eyes, which had been filled with hope and joy during her previous visits, but now burned with a cold fury that made Mikhail step backward involuntarily. She carried a bundle in her arms, wrapped in oiled leather to protect it from weather and damage. When she unwrapped it, Mikhail saw the white dress, still pristine despite everything that had happened. The silk seemed to glow in the lamplight, as beautiful as ever, but now carrying connotations that went far beyond mere clothing. Anya spoke in her native tongue, her voice harsh with emotion and exhaustion. Though Mikhail still couldn't understand her words, the meaning was clear enough. She knew what had happened, understood how she had been tracked, recognized his role in the disaster that had destroyed her world. For a moment, Mikhail thought she had come to kill him, and he found that he wouldn't have resisted such justice. The guilt he carried had grown so heavy that death seemed like a reasonable price for his unwitting betrayal. But instead of violence, Anya's expression shifted to something that might have been understanding or even forgiveness. She placed the dress on his workbench with the same careful reverence she had shown during her first visit. Then, she withdrew a leather scroll from her pack, unrolling it to reveal names written in her people's script. Hundreds of names, Mikhail realized, representing everyone who had died at the wedding celebration. Through gestures and expressions that transcended language barriers, Anya made her purpose clear. She wanted him to add these names to the account he was writing, to ensure that the victims of the massacre would be remembered as individuals rather than statistics. The wedding dress would serve as evidence, proof that these had been real people with real dreams rather than the anonymous terrorists described in official reports. The collaboration that followed was unlike anything Mikhail had ever experienced. Working together through long nights, using drawings and careful demonstrations to overcome language barriers, Anya helped him understand the full scope of what had been destroyed. She told him about the political alliances that had been shattered, the traditional knowledge that had been lost, the children whose futures had been erased in a single night of violence. Most importantly, she revealed the truth about the supposed murders that had justified the entire operation. The crime scenes photographed by the hunters had been staged, using bodies recovered from natural disasters and accidents, arranged to suggest brutality that had never occurred. Anya herself had been in the mountains for months before each supposed incident, dealing with clan business that dozens of witnesses could verify. The manufactured evidence was sophisticated and convincing, but it was entirely fictional. The international task force that had tracked her was not pursuing a killer, but eliminating a political inconvenience. The mountain clan's refusal to fully integrate with modern governmental structures had made them targets for a carefully planned genocide disguised as counterterrorism. As their work together continued, Mikhail began to understand that Anya was planning something far more significant than simple documentation. The names on her scroll represented not just the dead, but a network of relationships that extended throughout the mountain regions of Eastern Europe. There were other survivors, other clans that had not yet been targeted, other communities that could be warned about what was coming. The white dress, Anya explained through careful gestures, would serve a special purpose in the resistance she was building. It would be displayed at gatherings of the remaining free clans, a symbol of innocence destroyed and dreams shattered by those who claimed to represent justice. Every time someone saw it, they would remember that the fight was not just about territory or political autonomy, but about the right to exist differently in a world that demanded conformity. The dress would travel from community to community, clan to clan, carrying with it the story of the wedding massacre and the evidence that Mikhail was helping to compile. It would serve as both memorial and battle standard, ensuring that the dead were honored and the living understood what they were fighting against. When Anya finally prepared to leave, carrying with her copies of the documentation they had created together, Mikhail felt something approaching peace for the first time since learning the truth about the mountain operation. He could not undo his role in the tragedy, but he had helped ensure that it would not be forgotten or repeated without consequence. The white dress remained in his shop, displayed in the window where morning light could illuminate its beauty and significance. Customers occasionally asked about it, drawn by its obvious quality and the mysterious sadness that seemed to surround it. Mikhail would tell them it was not for sale, that it served as a memorial to someone special who had worn it only once. Years passed, and gradually the full story of the Carpathia massacres began to emerge through testimony gathered by human rights organizations, leaked documents from government archives, and the persistent advocacy of survivors like Anya. The wedding dress became a recognized symbol of the atrocities, displayed at memorials and remembrance ceremonies throughout Europe. Mikhail lived to see some measure of justice for the crimes he had unwittingly helped enable. Several of the officials who had ordered the mountain operations were eventually prosecuted, though many others escaped consequences through political protection or simple passage of time. The documentation he and Anya had created together proved crucial in establishing the truth about what had really happened in the sacred clearing where a wedding celebration had become a massacre. The shop continued to operate until Mikhail's death at the age of 78, serving customers who gradually learned to associate it with something more significant than simple tailoring. The white dress remained in its place of honor, a reminder that beauty and horror could be separated by the thinnest of margins, and that innocent actions could have consequences far